David Wheeler from Center for Global Development.
Hi, I'm David Wheeler, and it's a pleasure to be back. I was here for about 20 years in the bank, and it's great to see old friends and colleagues. And the theme today is for me, a beautiful harmony. And Aleem and Sheila really set things up very well. During a lot of my tenure in the bank, I was working on precisely the kinds of issues that we're talking about today with a very large group of people that expanded over time. And the theme was promoting transparency and accountability both inside the bank and outside the bank. And I thought among the topics that I could offer today would be some reflections on the experiences that we had trying to promote transparency and what we learned from that. And so very briefly, I'll give you two cases, one of which involved a lot of public disclosure work we did, principally in Asia, on pollution control, and the other has to do with forest monitoring in the context of financing RED programs for the amelioration of carbon emissions. And the first case really has to do with information in context, that is, what we learned from having tried to use public information to promote progressive change. And the second case will be on information in time, because we have a remarkable phenomenon these days, which is the telescoping of information into shorter and shorter cycles, and I think that's going to have profound consequences for the way that organizations and clients relate to each other, and specifically for the bank. So let me just then start with case one, which was provoked by the fact that in the early 90s, the bank got into environment in a serious way. Pollution was a tremendous issue in many client countries, as I'm sure many of you know, and yet there were real issues with conventional regulation. There was a corruption problem in many societies, there were technical problems, there were institutional problems. It was quite difficult to apply conventional models. So a group of people in the bank, some in operations and some in my crew in DEC, decided to try something very different, public disclosure. So we launched a set of public disclosure programs at very large scale in many of the major Asian countries, and also in Colombia and Mexico and Latin America. And the basic idea here was very simple, and that was to try to communicate information about performance in ways that the public could readily understand and use. And so, for example, in Indonesia, a program called Proper used pretty sophisticated technology to rate the environmental performance of polluters and then assign grades, which were color codes, which you can see up here on the report card: gold and green for great performance, blue for in the middle, and then red and black for lesser performance. So we launched that program, and we found that in a period of about 18 months, we did get a tremendous response from hundreds of polluting factories. These were mostly water polluters. And one could go on and on about why this occurred. I'll try to give you some lessons in a minute. But what's important in this graph is to see that most of the response was a rapid movement away from very poor performance toward compliance, but not really toward the upper end of the performance scale. We did a similar thing in Philippines. It was called EcoWatch in Philippines. If you look at the red and the black there, you'll see where things started. That was the share of enterprises that were performing quite poorly or fairly poorly, and then after the implementation of the program, you see that the blue, which is compliance, expands. We did a similar exercise in China with similar results, and finally one in Vietnam, and that was over a shorter period, and the results were less spectacular, but this was a big endeavor. It took us about 10 years to do this, and we learned a lot from that. So I thought, because it might be important in this context, I would try to share some of the things that we learned. And here, again, the major theme is information in context. What we learned basically is that putting numbers out seldom elicits a progressive response. People who are in advertising and media know a lot. Basically, disclosure is a strategic variable. If you want to promote progressive change with information, the packaging and timing of the presentation of that information are very critical variables. It took us, we were quite naive when we started this, but as we started color-coding performance for hundreds and then thousands of factories and working through the media to disclose this, and for us it was new, many of us were economists, we weren't used to thinking about the world this way, it became quite clear that information is well communicated if it's in symbolic form, frequently like colors, but symbols are quite powerful and they differ across cultures and communities fundamentally. We had a fascinating conversation with colleagues in China, for example, about whether we should use red for deficient performance. And the Chinese had an internal debate because on the one hand, this goes back to Mao and the East is red. I mean, red has a positive connotation. On the other hand, stoplights are red in China as well. So our colleagues in China finally decided, yes, we will say that red is bad for this particular thing. And when we started presenting these ideas in Colombia, using the Indonesian case where terrible performance is rated black, our Afro-Colombian friends immediately said, no, we're not doing that here. And since then, the same idea has gone to Ghana with the same result. So the lesson there is symbols are really powerful, and you cannot escape symbolism in the way you present information. Third lesson, I can say this and it sounds easy because it's obvious. Credibility requires good metrics. Sure, you need precise data. You need something more. To be credible, you have to unpack the process that has created the data in a way that is easy to understand. This is hard, but it's very important. People don't want to just zoom into a number. They want to know how you got it, and they don't want to read 20 footnotes. They want to understand the basic process. We learned very quickly that we could not promote such programs without providing those kinds of inputs. To our surprise, it turned out, because we were naive, that you couldn't just release data and get a result. It's not like that. There has to be leverage. That is to say, there has to be a touch point which provides a context for reacting to information. For example, in China, leverage was provided by promotion within the party and state enterprises. Once the party had accepted color-coded rating of factory performance and built it into promotions for factory managers, the response was forthcoming. Or in Indonesia, the banks very quickly got onto this because they learned that corporations or mills that were rated very poorly were basically in jeopardy from a regulatory perspective and therefore risky, and they started raising the interest rates to these places, a change in performance. So information was important, but it wasn't sufficient. You have to have some context for the interpretation, and we learned that leverage points differ wildly around the world. Some places it may be a religious organization, in other places a government regulation, and still another place it may be financial considerations. That one has to learn, again, in the context. Very important. Cannot divorce this stuff from context. Finally, to our pleased surprise, and we've done a lot of analyses and research on this, it turned out that in Indonesia, for example, disclosure was competitive. Consider yourself to be the head of a mill, let's say a pulp mill that's polluting a river. You have no idea how your competitors are doing because no one ever gave you that information. Proper suddenly provided comparative information for all of these people, and so for the first time they could assess their performance not as an absolute, but as a relative. And in the retrospective analyses that were done, that turned out to be 50% of the struggle. And so we've seen that then replicate itself time and time again, creating information that provides comparative perspective, which is easily interpreted, turns out to be a great key to making this work. Finally, and I'll close on this front, last rubric up there, don't expect miracles, but costs are important. If you recall when I showed the pie charts, we got a rapid movement toward compliance, but not too much movement beyond that with pure public disclosure. That's because quick fixes can be cheap, and there are a lot to be had in the pollution control business. Going to world standards is much more expensive. This requires a whole different apparatus. But nevertheless, we got 30 to 40% improvements pretty fast from exposing people to this kind of comparative information. That said, let me move along to case 2, which I'll call from red to green. As many of you know, RED is the UN program relating to reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation of tropical forest lands. There's a very important innovation behind RED, and that is, for the first time on large scale, you're going to provide a financial incentive by paying people the opportunity value of the land in forest that they conserve. It's a great idea, very important for climate finance, but it was clear to us a couple of years ago that there was a catch. The monitoring situation was really very bad because some of the information, although carefully accumulated and distributed, was years old, because it was very hard to assemble this information in coherent form. So, fools that we were, and this was at the Center for Global Development, we collaborated with a lot of people in NGOs, including WRI and people in the bank, to create a system that would go down to month-by-month, near real-time monitoring of forests. And I thought I would show you what that has resulted in as a context for talking about information in this dimension. We call it FORMA, Forest Monitoring for Action, and the Rural Resources Institute is now picking that up as a foundation for their Forest Watch 2.0, so I think you'll be hearing more about this. Let me just zoom to Indonesia for a second and the island of Sumatra, and specifically to Riau province, to give you a sense of the potential of this stuff. Now, in this 300-kilometer square area in Riau, the green there is what was forested in 2000. The brown here, if you can see it, is what was cleared between 2000 and 2005. Okay, now here comes FORMA. It basically processes terabytes of satellite data into coherent outputs. For example, now, as you see here, I'm going to run an animation every month from January 2006 to August of 2011. 1 second per month. You'll see it happen, and on the screen you'll see yellows turn to reds. Yellow means clearing is starting, red means it's well advanced. So let me just start this, and we can just back. Now watch this thing, and you can see there, what you're watching here is basically month by month the forest going down in this part of Sumatra. And you can just see this process spreading out from the initial clearing points. And so there we had a very fast look. But imagine now what we can do with this stuff. We never had this before. So there's a tremendous opportunity here because you can summarize this data in all kinds of interesting perspectives about relative rates of change. In this map, red are province, sub-provinces, or kabupatans that have grown faster than zero, and brown is areas that have grown more slowly in the period 2006 to 2011. For Indonesia as a whole, we never could do this before. Here's what's happened in our best assessment to forest clearing in Indonesia. For the last 5 years, there have been some cycles, but you can see that it's really down. When we first saw that, it was kind of surprising, but it's actually obviously very pleasing. There have obviously been things that have been working in Indonesia right along. So, what did we learn from this? Because we had to take stock of the implications. So let me just try to summarize in these 6 points, and then I'll close. First, harking back to Thomas Kuhn. Many of you probably had this inflicted on you in philosophy of science classes. The structure of scientific revolutions. Basic argument is, things change because youth knows different and age gradually retires, and so new paradigms come to the fore. And we now have world cultures in which people are quite comfortable in information environments that are really unprecedented. And that animation that I showed you is one representation of what is going to be coming on like a tidal wave across all these sectors. And that suggests, point 2, traditional decision cycles are just going to be obsolete. Think about the bank in the past, for example, where you prepare a project for a couple of years, you run the project, let's say in forest conservation for 4 years, and then IEG comes in 3 years later and tells you how it went. No, given the kind of paucity of information we had, that's what you were stuck with. Now this thing is telescoping down to month-by-month information. It is no longer going to be possible to run projects like that because everyone is going to have this information. And in addition, point 3, public feedback is going to intervene everywhere because once this channel is open, the reverse channel will also be open. One thing we're working on with Forma is an on-the-ground reporting facility where anybody can geolocate a report, send it back up the channel as a check to see how things are going. That's going to be massive. Which leads to point 4, what we might call institutional omniscience is waning fast. In the past, the idea was the bank takes a position that's been researched for years, we're confident in this, we're putting it out. Knowledge is going to become much more contingent and will have to be revised much more quickly. That, again, is a new world for big institutions, but I think it's an unavoidable world. And part of that is because there are more channels, just more decision factors. So, what this has convinced me of, this problem of information and time, is I look across the spectrum of available information. In the forest monitoring, which we've been involved in and many other people, I just gave you one representation of what's going on, is being replicated in sector after sector after sector now. So this is what's coming at you. I think that the implications for organizations like the bank and for all the bank's client countries will be revolutionary in the long term. But again, I would have to say in the near term, don't expect miracles, of course, because again, costs matter, institutions are stodgy, people have positions and vested interests. So they will give ground grudgingly, but give ground they will. Given the fact that we have this information available now, it's impossible for me to believe that the implications for decision making in the bank and elsewhere won't ultimately be revolutionary. Thank you very much.